Something quiet is happening in global trade, but it's beginning to draw attention in Washington in a way that's hard to ignore. Canada has been expanding its lumber exports beyond its traditional dependence on the United States and strengthening trade ties with Europe. On the surface, that may look like a routine diversification strategy, but in the world of trade policy, even gradual shifts in export patterns can signal deeper changes in economic relationships. Lumber is not just another commodity. It sits at the center of housing construction, infrastructure development, and industrial supply chains. When the flow of lumber changes direction, even slightly, it can influence pricing, availability, and long-term planning in multiple sectors. For decades, the United States has been the primary destination for Canadian softwood lumber. That relationship has been deeply interconnected, but also frequently disputed. Softwood lumber has been one of the most persistent trade friction points between the two countries, with repeated cycles of tariffs, negotiations, and legal challenges stretching over generations. Against that backdrop, Canada's increasing focus on European markets introduces a new layer of complexity. Europe has been actively seeking more sustainable and stable sources of construction materials, especially as environmental policies push builders toward lower carbon alternatives. Wood has become a key material in that transition, and Canadian lumber fits that demand profile well. This growing alignment between Canadian supply and European demand is not accidental. It reflects broader global trends in construction and sustainability. Many European countries are investing heavily in green building standards, encouraging the use of renewable materials in housing and infrastructure projects. That has created strong incentives for long-term lumber contracts and expanded trade cooperation. From Canada's perspective, this diversification is economically logical. Relying heavily on a single export market always carries risk, particularly in industries that are frequently affected by tariffs and political disputes. By strengthening ties with Europe, Canada gains additional stability, more pricing flexibility, and reduced exposure to North American trade volatility. But in Washington, these developments are being watched closely, not because there is an immediate disruption, but because trade relationships are not just about current flows of goods. They are also about leverage, dependency, and long-term strategic positioning. For years, U.S. policymakers have approached Canadian lumber as both a domestic industry issue and a trade policy concern. American lumber producers have argued that Canadian imports create competitive pressure, while Canadian officials have consistently defended their practices as fair and market-based. The result has been a long-standing pattern of disputes that resurface periodically, regardless of broader diplomatic relations. In that context, Canada's expansion into European markets subtly changes the equation. If Canadian producers have stronger alternative buyers, their dependence on the U.S. market decreases. And when dependence decreases, negotiating dynamics shift as well. This does not automatically mean confrontation. Trade systems are constantly adjusting, and countries routinely diversify their export portfolios. But it does mean that traditional assumptions about supply dependence may need to be reevaluated over time. For the U.S. housing sector, lumber is a critical input cost. Residential construction relies heavily on softwood lumber for framing, structural components, and finishing materials. Even modest changes in lumber pricing can influence construction budgets, project timelines, and ultimately home affordability. Builders operate on tight margins, and large-scale housing development requires predictable material costs. When markets become uncertain, whether due to tariffs, demand shifts, or supply reallocation, developers often respond by slowing project starts or adjusting pricing models. Over time, those adjustments can affect housing supply and affordability in broader ways. This is why policymakers and industry groups pay close attention to global lumber flows. It is not simply about trade balances or export volumes. It is about stability in one of the most essential building blocks of the housing economy. At the same time, Europe's increasing demand for Canadian lumber reflects its own structural priorities. Across the European Union, governments are pushing for greener construction practices. Timber is being promoted as a lower-emission alternative to steel and concrete in certain applications. This shift has created sustained demand for certified wood products, which Canada is well-positioned to supply. As these two trends develop in parallel, European demand growth and North American trade complexity, the global lumber market becomes more interconnected and more sensitive to policy changes. That sensitivity is what draws attention in Washington. Not necessarily because a crisis is unfolding, but because strategic planners are always looking ahead. They assess how supply chains evolve, how trade relationships shift, and how those changes could influence domestic industries over time. From a broader perspective, this is part of a larger global pattern. Countries are increasingly diversifying trade partnerships, reducing reliance on single markets, and seeking greater resilience in supply chains. That shift has been accelerated by recent global disruptions that exposed vulnerabilities in transportation, manufacturing, and resource distribution networks. Lumber is simply one example of this larger transformation. It sits at the intersection of housing demand, environmental policy, international trade, and economic strategy. That combination makes it more important than it might appear at first glance. Looking forward, the key question is not whether Canada will continue exporting lumber to the United States or Europe. It almost certainly will. The real question is how the balance between those markets evolves over time and what that means for pricing stability, trade negotiations, and long-term economic planning. For the United States, housing affordability remains a central concern. For Canada, trade diversification is a strategic priority. For Europe, sustainable construction materials are increasingly important. These goals are not necessarily in conflict, but they are not perfectly aligned either. And that is where the complexity lies. Because in modern global trade, even small shifts in supply chains can ripple outward in unexpected ways. What begins as a change in export destinations can eventually influence negotiations, industries, and policy decisions across multiple continents. That is why this story is being followed so closely, not because of sudden disruption, but because of gradual change. And in global economics, gradual change is often what reshapes the system the most. To understand why this shift matters, you first have to understand how deeply interconnected the North American housing and construction system really is. Most people think of housing as a local issue. A city builds homes, local contractors do the work, and buyers purchase properties within their own region. But in reality, nearly every major housing market in the United States is tied into a continental supply chain that stretches across borders, industries, and regulatory systems. Lumber is one of the clearest examples of this interconnected system. Softwood lumber is used in nearly every residential construction project in the United States. It forms the skeleton of homes, from framing walls to supporting roofs and floors. Because of this, even small fluctuations in lumber supply or pricing can ripple through the entire housing market. When supply is stable, builders can plan confidently. They can estimate costs, lock in contracts, and move forward with large-scale development projects. But when supply becomes uncertain, even slightly, that confidence begins to weaken. This is where global trade dynamics become important. Canada has long been one of the largest suppliers of softwood lumber to the United States. The two economies have built a highly integrated trade relationship over decades, supported by geography, infrastructure, and established supply chains. Mills in Canada produce lumber that is transported efficiently into American construction markets, feeding one of the largest housing systems in the world. However, this relationship has never been completely smooth. The softwood lumber trade has been one of the most persistent sources of economic tension between the two countries. At the center of the dispute is a fundamental disagreement over how Canadian forestry practices are structured compared to U.S. market conditions. American producers have often argued that Canadian pricing systems create an uneven competitive environment, while Canadian officials maintain that their system is based on different land ownership and resource management models. These disagreements have led to multiple rounds of tariffs and negotiations over the years. Sometimes tensions escalate, sometimes they cool, but the issue never fully disappears. That long history is important because it shapes how policymakers interpret any new development in the lumber trade. So when Canada begins expanding its export relationships with Europe, it is not viewed in isolation. It is seen through the lens of that long-standing North American trade relationship. Europe, for its part, is not simply a passive buyer in this system. Across the European Union, there has been a growing push towards sustainable construction practices. Governments are encouraging the use of renewable materials, and timber is increasingly being positioned as a climate-friendly alternative to more carbon-intensive building materials like steel and concrete. This policy direction has created strong and growing demand for certified wood products. Canada, with its large forest resources and established sustainability standards, is well positioned to meet that demand. As a result, trade between Canada and Europe has been expanding steadily, supported by broader agreements that reduce barriers and promote long-term economic cooperation. From a purely economic standpoint, this diversification makes sense for Canada. Relying heavily on a single export market exposes any commodity-based economy to significant risk. Prices can fluctuate, trade disputes can arise, and policy changes can disrupt established flows of goods. By expanding into multiple markets, Canada reduces that dependency and gains more flexibility in how it manages its forestry sector. But economic diversification always produces secondary effects. When supply is redirected or redistributed across multiple markets, the balance of global trade shifts. That shift does not necessarily reduce supply to any one region immediately. Instead, it changes the long-term expectations of market participants, and expectations matter just as much as physical supply. In financial and commodity markets, perception of future availability can influence pricing behavior, investment decisions, and contract structures long before actual shortages or surpluses occur. This is why policymakers in Washington pay attention to developments like these. It is not about immediate disruption, it is about future positioning. If Canada strengthens long-term contracts with European buyers, then its export structure becomes more diversified. That could reduce the relative importance of the U.S. market over time. And if that happens, it could subtly shift the balance of leverage in future trade discussions. Again, this does not imply conflict is inevitable. Trade relationships are dynamic, and both countries have strong incentives to maintain stable economic ties, but it does mean that assumptions based on historical patterns may need to be updated. For example, U.S. housing developers have long operated under the assumption that Canadian lumber will remain readily available as a primary input source. That assumption has generally held true for decades, even during periods of trade tension. However, if global demand patterns evolve, that assumption becomes more complex. Builders may begin to consider alternative sourcing strategies, prices may reflect broader international demand, supply chains may become more diversified, but also more sensitive to global conditions. This is how global markets evolve, not through sudden breaks, but through gradual recalibration. At the same time, it is important to recognize that Europe's demand for Canadian lumber is not accidental or temporary. It reflects structural changes in construction policy and environmental regulation. As governments prioritize lower carbon building methods, timber is increasingly being used not only in residential housing, but also in public infrastructure projects and commercial developments. That creates a stable and potentially growing demand base. For Canada, this represents an opportunity to position its forestry sector within a broader global sustainability framework. For Europe, it provides access to a reliable source of building materials that align with climate goals. For the United States, it introduces an additional variable into an already complex housing and construction equation. None of these outcomes are inherently negative. In fact, increased trade diversification can improve global efficiency and reduce risk concentration. But it does mean that traditional trade relationships become part of a larger, more interconnected system. And in such systems, small adjustments can have wide-reaching implications over time. That is the key point analysts are focused on. Not disruption, not crisis, but evolution. Because when supply chains evolve, so do economic relationships. And when economic relationships evolve, policy frameworks eventually follow. That is why this topic continues to generate attention in economic and political circles. It sits at the intersection of housing, trade, sustainability, and long-term strategic planning. And it is still unfolding. To fully understand why Washington is paying attention, you have to zoom out even further and look at how sensitive the U.S. housing system is to even small changes in construction inputs. Housing in the United States is not just another sector of the economy. It is one of the most systemically important drivers of employment, consumer spending, and financial stability. When housing is strong, related industries also tend to perform well. Construction, banking, furniture, appliances, logistics, and local services all benefit from increased activity. When housing slows down, the effects spread quickly in the opposite direction. That is why materials like lumber carry outsized importance in economic planning. Unlike many industrial inputs that can be substituted or delayed, lumber is fundamental to residential construction. It is embedded in nearly every stage of building a home. From framing to structural support, it is difficult to replace at scale without fundamentally changing construction methods and costs. Because of that, even moderate changes in global supply patterns can influence builder behavior. If prices rise too quickly, developers may delay projects. If supply becomes uncertain, lenders may become more cautious. If long-term cost projections become less stable, investment decisions can slow down. These adjustments may not always be dramatic, but they accumulate over time, and this is where international trade patterns become relevant again. When Canada increases its focus on European markets, it does not necessarily reduce supply to the United States in the short term, but it does broaden the range of demand sources competing for the same resource that can gradually reshape pricing expectations across global markets. In commodity systems, perception often matters almost as much as physical supply. Buyers and sellers constantly adjust expectations based on future demand trends, not just current availability. That means that even signals of diversification can influence long-term contracts, hedging strategies, and investment decisions. This is one reason governments and industry groups closely monitor trade flows between major partners. It is not just about what is happening today. It is about what markets expect to happen tomorrow. From the perspective of U.S. policymakers, the concern is not that Canada will suddenly stop exporting lumber to the United States. That is highly unlikely given the geographic proximity, infrastructure integration, and scale of existing trade. The concern is more subtle. It is about how the balance of dependence evolves over time. If Canada becomes increasingly integrated into European supply chains, then North American trade relationships may gradually shift from being highly dependent to more balanced. That change can influence how future negotiations unfold, particularly in sectors that have historically experienced tension. Softwood lumber is one of those sectors. For decades, it has been one of the most recurring points of disagreement in U.S.-Canada trade relations. The dispute is not new, and it is not simple. It involves differences in how forestry resources are managed, how pricing systems are structured, and how competitive fairness is interpreted. Because of that long history, even indirect changes in the market, like new export destinations, are viewed through a strategic lens. At the same time, Europe's growing demand for Canadian timber is not a short-term trend. It is tied to broader structural changes in how construction is being approached across the European Union. Sustainability goals have become central to infrastructure planning. Governments are actively encouraging low-carbon construction materials, and wood has emerged as a key component of that strategy. In some cases, timber is being promoted as a substitute for more carbon-intensive materials in residential and commercial construction. This shift has created consistent demand growth for certified wood products, particularly those that meet environmental and sustainability standards. Canada, with its vast forest resources and established certification systems, is well positioned to supply that demand. As a result, what appears to be a trade expansion is also part of a broader global transition toward greener construction practices. But transitions like this rarely occur in isolation. They reshape supply chains, they influence pricing structures, they change trade relationships, and over time they affect policy considerations in multiple regions simultaneously. That is why analysts in Washington are paying attention, not because of immediate disruption, but because of long-term implications. If European demand continues to grow and Canada continues to diversify its exports, then the global lumber market becomes more interconnected and more competitive at the same time. In such an environment, pricing stability becomes more complex, not necessarily worse, but more sensitive to global shifts in demand and policy. For the U.S. housing market, that means planning becomes more challenging at the margins. Developers may need to account for broader international demand when estimating costs. Supply contracts may become more globally influenced, and long-term forecasts may need to incorporate additional variables beyond traditional North American supply assumptions. None of this implies instability in a direct sense. Housing construction will continue. Trade will continue. Supply chains will continue to function, but the conditions under which they operate may become more dynamic. And in economic systems, dynamics matter because they shape expectations, and expectations shape behavior. At the same time, it is important to recognize that both Canada and the United States have strong incentives to maintain a stable and functional trade relationship. Their economies are deeply interconnected, and disruptions in key sectors like construction, energy, and manufacturing tend to create costs on both sides. That mutual dependency has historically encouraged negotiation rather than prolonged conflict. Even during periods of tension, both countries have typically found ways to manage disagreements through agreements, frameworks, and interim arrangements. That pattern is likely to remain relevant moving forward. However, the broader global context is changing. Supply chains are diversifying. Trade relationships are expanding beyond traditional partners, and economic security is becoming a more prominent consideration in policy decisions worldwide. In that environment, even long-established relationships are being reevaluated through new strategic lenses. That is the underlying story behind this issue. Not a sudden break, not a dramatic shift, but a gradual reassessment of how global trade networks are structured, and what that means for critical sectors like housing, construction, and infrastructure. As this process continues, one thing remains clear. The importance of lumber is not diminishing. If anything, it is becoming more central to discussions about affordability, sustainability, and economic resilience. And that is why this story continues to attract attention far beyond the forestry industry itself, because it sits at the intersection of global trade and everyday life. And that intersection is where the future of modern economies is increasingly being shaped.